The city of Stalingrad, nestled on the banks of the Volga River, held a name that carried immense symbolic weight. For Adolf Hitler, it represented a direct challenge to the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, a prize whose capture would deliver a devastating psychological blow to the USSR. For Stalin, it was a city that bore his name, a vital industrial hub, and a lifeline to the southern Soviet territories. In the summer of 1942, this city became the epicenter of one of the most brutal and defining battles in human history. The path to Stalingrad began with Operation Barbarossa, Germany's massive invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The German war machine, driven by lightning-fast blitzkrieg tactics, swept through vast expanses of Soviet territory, capturing cities and pushing Soviet forces to the brink of collapse. Hitler's strategic goals were grand: to cripple the Soviet Union's industrial capacity, secure vital resources like oil from the Caucasus, and eliminate communism as a political and ideological force. The capture of Stalingrad became a critical piece of this vision. By 1942, the German advance had slowed but remained a formidable threat. The Wehrmacht set its sights on the southern Soviet Union, where vital oil fields in the Caucasus promised the resources needed to fuel Hitler's war effort. Stalingrad, a major industrial and transportation hub on the Volga River, was a key gateway to this region. Beyond its strategic importance, Hitler saw the city as a personal challenge to Stalin himself. The propaganda value of capturing Stalingrad was enormous, and Hitler believed it would crush Soviet morale while boosting German prestige. The city was not just a strategic target, but also a symbol of Soviet resilience and pride. Stalin, aware of its importance, issued orders that the city must be defended at all costs. "Not one step back," became the rallying cry for Soviet forces, encapsulated in the infamous Order No. 227. Any soldier or officer who retreated without orders risked being shot as a traitor. For Stalin, the defense of the city was not just about military strategy. It was about proving the Soviet Union's ability to resist the Nazi onslaught. As the German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, began its push towards Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, the Soviet defenders prepared for a monumental struggle. The initial stages of the German offensive were devastating. Using their superior air power and artillery, the Germans reduced much of the city to rubble. Buildings crumbled under relentless bombing raids, and massive fires engulfed entire neighborhoods. Civilians, unable to evacuate, found themselves caught in the chaos. Many sought refuge in basements and makeshift shelters, but safety was a fleeting concept in a city under constant bombardment. Despite the destruction, the Soviet defenders refused to yield. The Red Army, composed of regular soldiers, conscripts, and even hastily armed civilians, turned every street and building into a battlefield. The ruins of Stalingrad became a labyrinth of death, where soldiers fought for control of individual rooms and staircases. The urban environment nullified many of the advantages of German blitzkrieg tactics, forcing the Wehrmacht into brutal close-quarters combat. The advance towards Stalingrad was not without challenges for the Germans. The logistical demands of supplying an army deep within hostile territory began to take a toll. The Volga River, which bordered Stalingrad, served as a critical supply line for Soviet forces, allowing reinforcements and supplies to flow into the embattled city despite German efforts to cut it off. The Soviets also employed scorched earth tactics, destroying infrastructure and resources to hinder the German advance. As the battle intensified, both sides poured enormous resources into the fight. For Hitler, Stalingrad became an obsession. He diverted troops and supplies from other fronts to ensure its capture, believing that victory there would pave the way for ultimate success in the Soviet Union. For Stalin, the city represented the line that could not be crossed. He reinforced the Red Army's presence with divisions pulled from across the Soviet Union, often sending them into the fray with minimal training or equipment. The human cost of the battle began to mount alarmingly. German soldiers faced grueling conditions as they fought through the ruined streets, often without adequate winter clothing or food. Soviet soldiers endured equally dire circumstances, their resolve stiffened by the knowledge that retreat was not an option. The civilian population, trapped in the midst of the fighting, suffered unimaginable hardships. Starvation, disease, and relentless shelling claimed countless lives. The ruins of Stalingrad became a hell's cape, where survival often depended on sheer luck and determination. Despite their early successes, the Germans soon found themselves bogged down in the urban quagmire of Stalingrad. The Red Army's ability to absorb devastating losses and continue fighting stunned the Germans, who had grown accustomed to quick victories. Soviet snipers, many of them civilians turned soldiers, became legendary for their ability to sow chaos and fear among the German ranks. The narrow alleys and crumbling buildings of the city favored defenders, turning every advance into a costly endeavor for the attackers. As the summer turned to fall, the German advance stalled. Stalingrad had become a battle of attrition, and the Wehrmacht was bleeding men and resources at an unsustainable rate. Hitler, however, refused to allow a retreat, insisting that Stalingrad must be taken at any cost. For the German soldiers on the ground, this meant enduring relentless counterattacks, dwindling supplies, and the harsh Russian winter, which was rapidly approaching. The road to Stalingrad was paved with ambition and hubris, a collision of two superpowers determined to dominate the Eastern Front. By the end of 1942, it was clear that the battle for the city would not be decided by strategy alone but by sheer endurance and the willingness to endure unimaginable suffering. Stalingrad had become the crucible in which the fate of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the war itself, would be decided. The German assault on Stalingrad began in earnest as summer gave way to autumn in 1942. What had initially been planned as a swift and decisive campaign evolved into a nightmarish grind of urban warfare. The city's defenders, emboldened by their orders to stand firm, turned Stalingrad into a fortress of resistance. Every street, factory, and ruined building became a battlefield, where life and death were decided in seconds. For both the Axis and the Soviets, the battle devolved into a test of will, fought amidst an unrelenting storm of fire and blood. The ruins of Stalingrad, created by relentless German bombing raids, provided an unconventional battlefield. The destruction worked against the Wehrmacht, which had relied on blitzkrieg tactics for swift victories in open terrain. In the city's rubble-strewn streets and crumbling buildings, German tanks were immobilized, and mobility was restricted. Soldiers fought brutal, close-quarters battles, with engagements often taking place at ranges of just a few feet. Snipers, particularly on the Soviet side, became legendary for their deadly precision. Men like Vasily Zaitsev turned the wreckage of Stalingrad into a hunting ground, their skill and patience decimating the ranks of the German forces. The conditions for combatants on both sides were almost indescribable in their horror. Soviet soldiers held strong and bombed out factories and residential areas, enduring constant attacks with dwindling supplies and reinforcements. German troops, accustomed to rapid victories, were unprepared for the grinding, attritional nature of the fighting. Supplies became a critical issue as the Wehrmacht's logistical network strained under the demands of supporting an extended campaign deep in Soviet territory. Food, ammunition, and medical aid were scarce, and soldiers on both sides suffered from exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. Civilians trapped in the city endured unimaginable suffering. Many lived in makeshift shelters or the remnants of their homes, constantly under threat from bombs, artillery shells, and stray bullets. Starvation claimed countless lives, and access to clean water became nearly impossible. Despite their plight, many civilians contributed to the defense of Stalingrad, whether by building fortifications, assisting the wounded, or even taking up arms. For those who could not fight, survival was an act of defiance against the horrors of war that surrounded them. The industrial sector of Stalingrad, including the massive tractor factory, Red October steelworks, and Barricade Arms Factory, became iconic battlegrounds. These sprawling complexes, reduced to twisted metal and rubble, were scenes of some of the fiercest fighting of the entire war. Soviet workers and soldiers fought side by side to defend these sites, often engaging German forces at point-blank range. The factories, which once produced machinery for Soviet industry, now churned out makeshift weapons and tanks even as battles raged within their walls. One of the defining characteristics of the Battle of Stalingrad was the sheer relentlessness of the Soviet resistance. Stalin's infamous Order No. 227, Not one step back, underscored the desperation and determination of the Red Army. Penal battalions composed of disgraced soldiers and political prisoners were thrown into the fray, often as shock troops, with the understanding that retreat would mean execution. Despite the draconian measures, Soviet morale was bolstered by a sense of duty to defend their homeland from an invading force that had already wrought unimaginable suffering across the USSR. As autumn turned to winter, the battlefield transformed once again. Temperatures plunged below freezing, and snow blanketed the city's ruins. German troops, poorly equipped for winter warfare, suffered immensely from frostbite and hypothermia. Soviet forces, more accustomed to the harsh conditions, used the weather to their advantage. They launched counterattacks that exploited the Germans' lack of mobility and diminishing resources. The Soviet Union's ability to maintain a steady stream of reinforcements and supplies across the Volga River was a crucial factor in the defense of Stalingrad. Despite relentless German bombing runs targeting the river crossings, Soviet barges and ferries continued to deliver fresh troops, weapons, and food to the besieged defenders. This lifeline allowed the Red Army to regroup and reorganize, even in the face of the German onslaught. By November 1942, the Germans had pushed deep into the city but were unable to deliver the decisive blow needed to claim victory. Soviet resistance, coupled with the increasingly dire conditions faced by the Wehrmacht, turned the battle into a quagmire. Hitler's obsession with capturing Stalingrad at all costs led to critical strategic errors. Reinforcements that might have been used to bolster other fronts were instead funneled into a city that had become a death trap for the German Sixth Army. Amidst the ruins of Stalingrad, a psychological battle unfolded alongside the physical one. Both sides sought to break the other's will to fight, employing propaganda, psychological warfare, and displays of resilience to demoralize their enemy. For the Germans, every advance seemed to come at an ever greater cost, while the Soviets, though battered and bloodied, found strength in their unwavering determination to hold the line. As the battle dragged on, it became clear to the Germans that their initial expectations of a swift victory had been a grave miscalculation. Stalingrad had become a meat grinder, consuming men and material at an unsustainable rate. The fighting showed no signs of abating, and the specter of Soviet counteroffensives loomed large. For the men on the ground, whether German or Soviet, the battle had become a nightmarish ordeal, a relentless struggle for survival in a city that had become a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. By late 1942, the stage was set for a dramatic shift in the balance of power at Stalingrad. The Red Army, having absorbed the full force of the German advance, prepared to unleash a counteroffensive that would turn the tide of the battle and alter the course of the war on the Eastern Front. But for now, the city remained a maelstrom of destruction, its defenders clinging to their positions with unyielding resolve, their sacrifices laying the groundwork for the events to come. As the brutal struggle for Stalingrad continued into late 1942, the Soviet Union prepared a bold counteroffensive that would transform the battle and the Eastern Front entirely. Known as Operation Uranus, the plan aimed to encircle the German Sixth Army and its supporting units, trapping them within the ruins of the city they sought to conquer. The operation required precision, coordination, and secrecy, elements that the Soviet High Command, or Stavka, executed masterfully. The German position in and around Stalingrad had grown increasingly precarious. Focused on capturing the city at all costs, Hitler had stretched his forces thin. The flanks of the Sixth Army, critical to holding their position, were manned not by German troops but by Axis allies, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions. These units were poorly equipped and lacked the training and resolve of the German forces. Soviet planners recognized this weakness and targeted these vulnerable flanks in their counteroffensive. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. From the north and south of Stalingrad, massive Soviet forces surged forward, overwhelming the Axis defenders on the flanks. The offensive was a stunning display of coordination and firepower. Artillery barrages shattered defensive positions, and waves of tanks and infantry swept through the breaches. The Romanian units, unable to withstand the ferocity of the Soviet assault, crumbled under the pressure, leaving vast gaps in the German lines. As Soviet forces advanced, their pincers closed around the German Sixth Army. By November 23, the northern and southern Soviet armies met near the town of Kalach, completing the encirclement. More than 250,000 German and Axis troops were trapped inside the city and its outskirts. The encirclement was a catastrophic blow to the Wehrmacht, cutting the Sixth Army off from reinforcements and supplies. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, now found himself in an impossible situation. His troops were exhausted, starving, and ill-equipped for the harsh Russian winter. The Soviet encirclement created a logistical nightmare for the Germans. Supplies could only be delivered by air, and even that was a near impossible task. The Luftwaffe, tasked with supplying the Sixth Army, struggled to deliver a fraction of the necessary food, ammunition, and medical supplies. German soldiers were reduced to eating horses, dogs, and in some cases, scavenging whatever they could find in the ruins of the city. Disease, frostbite, and starvation took a brutal toll, killing thousands before they even faced combat. Despite the dire circumstances, Hitler refused to allow Paulus and the Sixth Army to retreat. Obsessed with capturing Stalingrad, he issued orders for them to hold their positions at all costs, promising reinforcements that would never arrive. The once mighty Sixth Army was now little more than a trapped and starving force, its soldiers fighting not for victory but for survival. Inside the encirclement, the conditions were horrific. The harsh Russian winter had set in, with temperatures plunging well below freezing. German soldiers huddled in bombed-out buildings, struggling to stay warm and avoid frostbite. Ammunition was rationed, leaving soldiers to face Soviet attacks with dwindling resources. The Soviets, for their part, tightened the noose around the trapped army, launching relentless assaults and gradually reducing the pocket of resistance. The situation grew even more desperate as the Soviet forces fortified their positions and prepared for the final phase of the battle. Soviet propaganda blared through loudspeakers, urging the Germans to surrender and promising humane treatment. For many German soldiers, surrender was unthinkable, both because of Nazi indoctrination and the fear of retribution from the Soviets. However, as the days turned into weeks, and the encircled troops continued to suffer and die, some began to see surrender as their only option. In December 1942, German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted a rescue operation, known as Operation Winter Storm, to break the Soviet encirclement. The plan involved a counterattack by German forces outside Stalingrad to open a corridor to the trapped Sixth Army. Although Manstein's forces made some progress, they ultimately fell short. Paulus, ordered by Hitler to stay put and fight to the end, refused to break out of the encirclement, even as his army withered away. By January 1943, the Soviet forces began their final push to crush the remaining German resistance in Stalingrad. Soviet troops stormed the last strongholds, methodically eliminating pockets of resistance. The once formidable Sixth Army was now a shadow of its former self. Starving, frostbitten, and demoralized, the remaining soldiers could barely mount an effective defense. On January 31, 1943, General Paulus, recently promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler in a symbolic attempt to encourage him to fight to the death, chose to surrender. The surrender marked the first time a German Field Marshal had been captured alive, a humiliation for Hitler and a symbol of the Wehrmacht's defeat. Over 91,000 German and Axis soldiers were taken prisoner, though the majority would never return home, succumbing to disease, exhaustion, or harsh conditions in Soviet captivity. The Battle of Stalingrad was over, and with it, the myth of German invincibility. The victory was a monumental turning point in the Eastern Front and the entire war. The Soviet Union had not only stopped the German advance but had inflicted a devastating defeat, setting the stage for their westward push that would eventually lead to Berlin. Stalingrad had become a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the extraordinary human cost of total war. The aftermath of the Battle of Stalingrad left a deep and lasting impact on both the Eastern Front and the broader course of World War II. For the Soviet Union, the victory was a monumental turning point, a testament to the resilience and determination of its people and military. For Germany, the defeat was a catastrophic blow, marking the beginning of a long and grueling retreat that would eventually end in the ruins of Berlin. The cost of the battle was staggering. By its conclusion in February 1943, over 2 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, had perished or been wounded. Stalingrad became synonymous with suffering on an unimaginable scale. The city itself was little more than a smoldering wasteland, its buildings reduced to rubble, its infrastructure shattered, and its population decimated. Yet, despite the devastation, Stalingrad emerged as a symbol of Soviet resistance, an enduring reminder of the price paid to halt the Axis advance. For the Germans, the surrender of the Sixth Army was a psychological and strategic disaster. Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs had turned a potential tactical withdrawal into an annihilation. The defeat shattered the Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility, emboldening the Allies and weakening German morale. The loss of hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers and critical equipment left a gaping hole in the German war effort, one that could not be easily filled. On the Soviet side, the victory at Stalingrad marked a turning point not only in the war but also in the Soviet Union's role as a global superpower. The Red Army, once on the defensive, now shifted to a sustained offensive campaign. With the momentum from Stalingrad, Soviet forces launched operations to reclaim lost territory, driving the Germans westward. The battles of Kursk, Leningrad, and eventually the March on Berlin were all shaped by the confidence and lessons learned at Stalingrad. The political and symbolic significance of Stalingrad extended far beyond the battlefield. For Stalin, the victory solidified his position as a leader capable of guiding his nation through its darkest hours. The battle became a propaganda tool, used to inspire the Soviet people and rally them around the war effort. In the West, Stalingrad was seen as a critical blow to Nazi Germany, a moment that turned the tide in favor of the Allies. Leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt praised the Soviet contribution to the war, acknowledging the immense sacrifices made on the Eastern Front. For the soldiers who fought at Stalingrad, the battle left scars that would never fully heal. Survivors from both sides carried the physical and emotional weight of what they had endured. Many German prisoners of war were sent to Soviet labor camps, where harsh conditions and inadequate supplies led to the deaths of tens of thousands. Those who eventually returned home did so years later, bearing the trauma of captivity and defeat. Soviet soldiers, too, bore the mental toll of surviving one of the most brutal engagements in history, their victories tempered by the loss of comrades and the horrors they had witnessed. The legacy of Stalingrad was profound and enduring. In the years following the war, the city, renamed Volgograd in 1961, became a site of remembrance and reverence. Monuments and memorials were erected, including the iconic Mamayev Kurgan complex, featuring the towering statue. The Motherland Calls. These commemorations served as reminders of the sacrifices made and the resilience shown during the battle. For many Russians, Stalingrad remains a source of national pride, a symbol of their country's ability to withstand and overcome even the most formidable challenges. On the global stage, Stalingrad stands as one of the most studied battles in military history. It is often cited as a textbook example of urban warfare, strategic encirclement, and the devastating effects of attritional conflict. Military academies and historians analyze the decisions, strategies, and human factors that shape the outcome, seeking lessons that remain relevant to this day. The brutality of the battle also serves as a somber reminder of the costs of war. Stalingrad was not just a clash of armies but a struggle that consumed an entire city and its people. It highlighted the depths of human suffering and the lengths to which nations will go to secure victory. The ruins of the city, the mass graves, and the stories of those who lived and died there bear witness to the horrors of total war and the resilience of the human spirit. Ultimately, Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a turning point that reshaped the trajectory of World War II. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's ambitions, setting the stage for the Allied victories that would follow. At the same time, it solidified the Soviet Union's position as a dominant force in the post-war world, reshaping geopolitics for decades to come. The legacy of Stalingrad endures as a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the enduring will to survive and prevail against overwhelming odds.